identified and located the devices that operate and control the 6 sequences of both the retract and erect cycles on the 1957 through 1959 Ford Skyliner retractable hardtop. In this volume, we will adjust the top and deck lid mechanisms and see how to maintain them for smooth operation. Along the way, you will learn a few things the shop manual doesn't tell you. For the purpose of this presentation, we will start with the top fully erect and locked, and the deck lid closed and locked. You will also want to chock the wheels or set the emergency brake. Okay, let's get started. Let's begin with the neutral switch. Loosen the 2 screws that clamp the neutral switch mounting bracket to the steering column and rotate the assembly down far enough to have access to the top of the switch. Be sure the nut that attaches the switch to the bracket is tight. With the gear shift in neutral, loosen the screw that holds the switch actuator to the gear shift shaft. Line up the switch assembly and the actuator. Hold a 1/64th inch shim or a 16,000th gauge or a dime on top of the switch plunger, then squeeze them together until the switch is at the end of its travel. Tighten the switch actuator on the gear shift and tighten the mounting bracket screws. This procedure worked fine when the car was relatively new, or if you have replaced the neutral switch. But after many years of going through the gears, the switch plunger gets a groove worn in it, and this adjustment won't work. You can replace the switch, or, if you have an automatic transmission, reposition it so it operates in park. To me, this is safer and more convenient when you are showing the car, and it's easy to do. Just loosen both the switch bracket and the actuator screws. Put the gear selector in park, and rotate the bracket and actuator until the switch and the actuator meet. Then push and hold them together so the plunger is at the end of its travel. Tighten the actuator and bracket screws, and you're done. Since the actuator now never goes past the switch, it's not necessary to have any clearance between the two, and the wear problem is eliminated. In order to make the adjustments on the top and rear deck, you must have access to the luggage compartment. 12 volts DC must be available to the system. A fully charged car battery will do, but I like to keep a charger connected to the battery while working on the mechanisms. The charger should be capable of providing at least 40 amps. This ensures that proper power is provided to the motors without having to run the engine and reduces the strain on the battery. With the ignition switch in the accessory position and the transmission in neutral, or park if you have readjusted the interlock switch, unlock and open the deck lid by operating the actuating switch. If the deck lid will not unlock, remove the rear seat cushion and backrest, then remove the cover from the relay control box. Check for 12 volts at the input, passenger side, of the control relays with a meter or voltage probe. If the 12 volts is not present, you can connect the positive side of a battery and or charger to the input side on one of the control relays and the negative side to the chassis. Then, using a 10 or 12 gauge jumper wire, connect one end to 12 volts and touch the other end to the output side of the deck unlock relay. To be sure of jumping the proper relay, I like to keep the control box cover with the relay position layout on top of the control box. deck still doesn't unlock, it will be necessary to unlock it manually. To manually unlock the deck lid, the shop manual says to raise the rear of the car 9 inches. This will allow enough room between the tires and the fender wells to gain access to the half-inch bolts that attach the deck lock nut assemblies to the chassis. However, it is quite a bit easier to work if you set the rear end up on jack stands and remove the rear tires. Remove the bolts from the left and right rear fender wells. After 40 years or so, it's possible that the bolts have rusted to the captive nuts inside the trunk. The thin sheet metal that holds the nuts captive will twist with the nut. At this point, your only option is to drill out or cut the heads off the bolts. Once the bolts have been removed, manually raise the deck lid a half-inch or so on the passenger side at the rear window. This will allow the deck position B switch to operate, and you can now attempt to open the deck lid with the actuator switch or by jumping the deck open relay. If the deck lid will not open, it too can be done manually. Simply remove the 4 bolts, 2 on each side, that attach the deck lift jacks to the chassis. These bolts are located behind the rear bumper on either corner of the rear quarter panels. As the bolts are loosened, the deck lift assist springs will raise the deck lid. You will need some assistance to hold the deck lid down. Once the bolts are removed, allow the deck lid to rise just enough to remove the cleavage pins from the top of the lift jacks. This must be done to avoid damaging the flexible drive shafts and the trunk lining board. Now raise the deck lid and prop it open with a length of wood. If you manually unlock the deck lid, remove the lock nut assemblies from the lock screws and reinstall them in their mounting brackets. Position the assembly so the O-ring is centered in the housing support. The foot on the lock nut assembly may be moved up or down on the wheel well, and if necessary, the length of the shaft can be adjusted by loosening the lock nut and turning the shaft. Install the lock retaining screws with a lock washer, flat washer, and rubber washer through the wheel wells and into their nuts with a rubber washer and flat washer in between. With the deck lid open, check all linkage for damage and replace as necessary. Be sure all pivot point nuts are tight. Now let's do some maintenance on the deck lock screws. We're going to work on the driver's side assembly and adjust the deck lock limit switch. The passenger side is identical, except there is no switch attached. Remove the screws that hold the flexible drive shaft clamps and disconnect the flexible drive shaft from the deck lock motor. Remove the ground wire, then remove the 2 nuts that hold the deck lock screw assembly to the deck lid. Remove the lock screw assembly from its bolts, then disconnect the wiring at the connector. Remove the deck lock limit switch assembly and transmission cover. Wipe the old grease from around the gear and remove the lock ring, switch actuator, and washer. Check the transmission for smooth operation by turning the flexible drive shaft. If there is any roughness in the bearings, they can be replaced. These are in good shape, so we will just repack the screw bearing. We will replace a worm gear bearing in volume 3. The drive shaft can be removed from the assembly by twisting and pulling the casing while holding the transmission. Support the casing with an 1¼ inch socket and drive the lock screw through the gear and the bearing out of the casing with a soft-faced hammer. The soft metal retaining the bearing will spread out of the way. Remove the gear from the housing and clean up all the parts. Be careful not to get any cleaning solution in the worm gear bearing. Allow the rubber bushings to soak in rubber cleaner and lubricant until you are ready for reassembly. Repack the screw bearing with new grease. We are using a white lithium-based grease because it doesn't stiffen up in cold weather. Replace the bearing and screw in the housing. Then repeen the casing around the bearing with a small drift. Hold the drift at a slight angle inward so the metal is pushed over the end of the bearing. Pack new grease into the worm gear and around the gear housing. Line up the flat spot on the driven gear with the flat side of the shaft and install the gear. may be necessary to turn the worm gear slightly to allow the driven gear to fully seat. Install the washer and lock ring, making sure the lock ring is fully seated in its groove. Pack the rest of the gear housing with grease and replace the cover. Replace the switch actuating pin and check the mechanism for freedom of movement. Mount the switch assembly on its bracket and tighten the mounting screws until the lock washers just make contact. Slide the flexible drive shaft out of its casing and wipe off the old lubricant. Reconnect the drive shaft sleeve to the assembly. Apply a light coat of grease to the drive shaft and slide it into its casing. Turn the drive shaft to be sure everything is working properly. Reconnect the wiring and install the lock screw assembly. Do not tighten down the mounting screws at this time. flexible drive shaft to the deck lock motor and install the drive shaft clamp screw. Deck and roof lock screws require a lock nut to make the adjustments. If you don't have a spare, remove one from a deck lock. To remove the lock nut, back off the clamping screw on the side of the lock nut housing. If you don't have tool T57P-53874-A, a pair of needle nose pliers will work. We are using a tool we made from a 1 1/4 inch freeze plug. This adjustment could have been made on the bench with an ohmmeter or self-powered test light, but since everyone will not be removing the deck lock screws, we will do it on the car. The deck lock limit switch and the deck position B switch are wired in such a manner that if either switch is allowed to operate, the cycle indicator light on the dashboard will come on. To adjust the deck lock limit switch, you can eliminate the deck position B switch from the circuit by disconnecting one of its connectors or by holding the switch open with a C-clamp. With the ignition switch in the accessory position, screw the lock nut onto the deck lock screw until it ratchets. Now, back it off 1/2 turn. Adjust the switch until the cycle indicator light just comes on. Tighten the mounting screws and recheck the adjustment. The cycle indicator light should come on when the nut is 1/2 turn from the ratchet point. Readjust if necessary. Remove the lock nut and set it aside for now. You will need it later for the front roof position C and D switch adjustments. While we are back here, let's do some maintenance on the deck lift jacks. If you manually open the deck lid, the lift jacks are already free of the chassis. If not, prop the deck lid open and remove the 4 bolts that attach the deck lift jacks as described for manually opening the deck lid. Remove the lock rings from the lift jack upper pivot pins and remove the pivot pins. Disconnect the flexible drive shafts at the transmission assembly and remove the lift jack assemblies. Remove the plastic sleeve, then turn the lift jack shaft all the way down on the screw and remove the lock ring from the top of the screw. Remove the jack shaft from the screw and retrieve the washers and seal from inside the shaft. There should be a flat washer, a seal, and a cup-shaped washer. Mark the transmission casing and covers so they can be properly aligned during reassembly. Remove the 5 screws that attach the cover to the transmission assembly and remove the cover. transmission for smooth operation by turning the worm gear with a small screwdriver. If there is any roughness in the bearings, they can be replaced. We will look at how to do that in Volume 3. Remove the nut that holds the gear and screw together, then remove the gear from the housing. There is another set of washers and a seal on the end of the screw. Clean up all the parts, pack new grease around the worm gear, and install the large gear, washers, seal, and the jack screw. Note that this gear is keyed to the shaft with a Woodruff key. Pack new grease into the gear housing. Line up the marks you made on the housing and cover and install the cover screws. Lubricate the jack screw, then run the shaft down and up the screw to spread the grease. Wipe off any excess. Install the flat washer, seal, and cup-shaped washer on the top end of the screw. Then install the lock ring. Repeat the process for the other lift jack, then reinstall the lift jacks. If you are working alone, set the mounting brackets in place. Turn the jack shaft out until the holes in the shaft line up with the hole in the hinge, and install the pivot pins. Do not put lock rings on the pivot pins yet. Remove the prop from the deck lid to allow the weight of the deck to hold the lift jacks in place while you install the mounting bolts. We need to be sure that the lift jacks are operating on the same plane so that both sides of the deck lid open and close at the same time. To do this, remove the trunk lining board on the passenger side to gain access to the deck open limit switch. Loosen the mounting screws on the deck open limit switch. Reconnect the drive shaft to the deck lift jacks and jump the deck open relay until one of the hinges just touches its stop. Remove the clevis pin from the opposite lift jack. Hold this hinge against its stop by pushing up on the deck lid. Readjust the jack shaft so the holes line up and replace the clevis pin. We may as well adjust the deck open limit switch at this time. We already loosened the mounting screws and the deck is fully open, so just insert a 1/10 inch gauge between the switch plunger and the actuator on the hinge. Hold the switch firmly against the gauge with the plunger at the end of its travel and tighten the mounting screws. Now we need to unlock the roof. Once again, if the roof will not unlock using the actuating switch or by jumping the roof unlock relay, it can be done manually. To gain access to the front roof lock nuts, remove the sun visors and rear view mirror, and then remove the garnish molding from the windshield header. Now remove the 4 large Phillips head screws that attach the front roof locks to the header. To get to the rear roof lock bolts, it is necessary to remove the 2 pieces of garnish molding from the rear roof on both sides. Slip the trim panels out of their trim molding and remove the power link access hole covers. Remove the 2 1/2-inch bolts that hold the roof lock bolt to the roof on both sides. Note that removal of the molding, trim panels, and access covers is necessary even if the roof unlocked electrically. With the roof unlocked, raise the roof until you have easy access to the front roof garnish molding. If you cannot raise the roof with the actuating switch or by jumping the power relay, you will have to correct this problem before you can proceed. If you have manually unlocked the roof, unscrew the front lock nuts from their lock screws and replace them in the windshield header. Do not tighten the mounting screws past the point of lock washer contact at this time. Note that the right lock nut is installed with the set screw to the right of the nut, and the left lock nut is installed with the set screw to the left of the nut. Remove the garnish molding and the 4 large Phillips head screws that attach the front roof lock assemblies to the roof header. We are now ready to go through the top adjustment procedures. Disconnect the flexible drive shafts at the front roof lock motor and move the front roof lock assemblies out far enough to gain access to the circuit connectors. Unplug the connectors and remove the lock assemblies. This is a good time to do a little maintenance on the roof locks. These assemblies are basically the same as the deck lock assemblies, and procedures for disassembly, cleaning, lubricating, and reassembly are the same. There are 2 switches on each front roof lock assembly. The one with the short plunger is in the roof lock circuit. To make the adjustment, screw a lock nut fully on the lock screw until it ratchets. Then back it off 1/2 turn. Connect your ohm meter or continuity tester to the 2 male connectors farthest from the female connector. Adjust the switch until the circuit just closes. Tighten the screw closest to the switch, just enough to keep it in place. The switch with the long plunger is in the roof motor circuit during the retract cycle. This switch should close when the lock nut is one full turn before disengaging from the lock screw. Connect your circuit tester to the female connector and the male connector closest to the female connector. Adjust the switch assembly to meet the requirement and recheck the roof lock circuit switch. When the assembly is adjusted so that both switches operate at the correct position of the lock nut, tighten the mounting screws. Repeat the procedure for the other front roof lock assembly and reinstall both assemblies. Reconnect the flexible drive shafts to the roof lock motor. Be sure to route the wiring harness around the assemblies so that it does not interfere with the switch operation. Around the assemblies so that it does not interfere with the switch operation. Install the mounting screws. Do not tighten the screws past the point where the lock washers make contact at this time. To prepare for the roof adjustments, loosen the front block nut set screws and raise the lock nuts in their brackets until the top of the nut is slightly above the bracket. This will ensure that the lock screws fully seat in their nuts. We will make this adjustment properly later. If you push down on the inside of the lock nuts, you will notice that the internal piece is spring-loaded. This is the part that ratchets when the shoulder of the lock screw contacts the shoulder of the lock nut. The lock screws must fully engage the lock nuts to their ratchet point for their switches to operate properly. If you manually unlock the top, remove the rear lock bolts from their lock nuts and bolt them back to the rear of the roof. Do not tighten the bolts past lock washer contact at this time. If you don't have a spare rear roof lock screw, back off the set screw that holds one of the rear roof lock screws and remove the lock screw. Maintenance on the rear roof lock nut assemblies is similar to the other transmissions. Remove the roof lock cover plate and disconnect the flexible drive shaft at the motor. Remove the two mounting bolts. Disconnect the electrical connectors and remove the assembly. switch and actuating pin. Remove the lock screw guide and transmission cover. Note that the switch mounting bracket is attached to the cover plate by a post that has been peened over. These have a tendency to work loose from the pressure of the switch and should be re-peened. Clean and lubricate the assembly as we did with the deck block screws. Reassemble and install the switch. Turn the lock screw into the lock nut until it ratchets. Place your continuity tester across the contacts furthest from the plunger. Position the switch so that the contacts close when the lock screw is 1/2 turn from the ratchet point. Remove the lock screw and replace the assembly in the car. Reconnect the electrical connectors. Do not tighten the mounting bolts past lock washer contact at this time. Reconnect the flexible drive shaft. And replace the cover plate. Repeat the process on the other lock nut assembly. The roof position B and roof erect and delay switches may also be adjusted in the car. The shop manual says to connect a test light to the contacts furthest from the plunger, but you can't even see the contacts, much less get a test lead on them. I find it is easier to disconnect the two plugs to the switch and place the continuity tester across the male contacts that are farthest from the female contacts on both connectors. Loosen two screws that hold the switch. Position the switch so that the contacts close when the lock screw is 1/2 turn from the ratchet point. Tighten the screws, retest and reposition switch if necessary. Repeat the process on the roof erect and delay switch, the one on the passenger side, except that the contacts you need to read across are the female contact and the closest male contact on the connector that has only one male contact. Install the rear roof lock screw that we removed earlier. For now, adjust both the left and right screws until there is about 2 3/4 inches extending out as measured from the bracket to the end of the screw. Align the groove in the lock screw with the set screw and tighten the set screw. We will make this adjustment properly later. These adjustments can affect the vent, door, and quarter window seals and should be made with the windows down and the doors open. The front roof adjustments need to be made first as they affect the front roof lock alignment. There are 3 adjustments provided to obtain continuity between the front and rear roof assemblies. The hinge adjustment provides fore and aft and up and down positioning. The front roof stops limit the upward travel of the front roof section, and the rear roof turnbuckles affect where, in the erect cycle, the front and rear roof reach continuity. begins by retracting the roof about halfway, stop the cycle, and start the erect cycle. Stop the erect cycle when the roof lock screws are 1 or 2 inches above the windshield header. At this point, the front and rear roof sections should be aligned so there is a uniform contour to the roof, and there should be approximately 1/10 of an inch between the front and rear roof sections. To make these adjustments, the shop manual says the roof should be blocked off the header with most of the weight on the blocks to assure contact of the front roof stops with the rear roof. The key word here is most. If all the weight of the roof is on the blocks, it is extremely hard to move and hold the front roof in position while the hinge mounting screws are tightened. You also have to wonder if the stop should be adjusted first. The easiest way I found to make these adjustments is to retract the roof until the front roof stop screws are easily accessible. Then set the front roof stops so their heads are about 1/4 of an inch beyond the back edge of the front roof. Now erect the roof to the position where the front roof lock screws are 1 inch or 2 above the windshield header. Loosen the 3 screws that retain the hinge bracket to the front roof side rail on both sides. You will need an offset wrench to reach the bolt behind the hinge pivot. At the rear roof turnbuckle, loosen the lock nut and turn the turnbuckles to force the roof front up to the point where the stops contact the rear roof. Now you can hold the roof front in position while you tighten the hinge bracket screws. Readjust the stop screws for the correct gap between the front and rear roof sections. Then adjust the turnbuckles so the roof sections come into alignment when the front roof is about 2 inches off the header. This requires cycling the roof back and forth a few times until you get it right. Tighten the turnbuckle lock nuts when you're finished. If you haven't already done so in the preceding steps, loosen all mounting screws on the roof lock assemblies. You want the screws loose enough for the locks to move, but not too loose. The easiest way to do this is to back the screws out until they turn freely, then tighten them until the lock washers just make contact with the mounting surface. Loosen the lock nuts and turn the rear roof bumpers in toward the roof as far as they will go. Actuating switch, or by jumping the roof erect relay, move the top to the point of lock engagement. If necessary, manually move the top around until all 4 locks are engaged. Do not lock the roof down at this time. Disconnect the right and left flexible drive shafts at the roof motor. Remove the bolts from the base of the lift jacks. Loosen the lock nuts and back off the right and left control link adjusting screws until they no longer contact the linkage. Loosen the 4 power link pivot bracket retaining nuts on both sides. Loosen each nut, then retighten it until the lock washer contacts the bracket. The shop manual warns that the adjusting plate can be permanently damaged if these nuts are too loose. If the roof was manually unlocked, you will have to fix that problem before you can proceed. Jump the roof lock relay to lock the roof. Then unlock the roof partway by jumping the roof unlock relay. Once again, lock the roof from the roof lock relay. These actions should move all the lock assemblies into alignment, and all 4 lock screws should ratchet at this point. Now would be a good time to clean and lubricate the roof lift jacks. To remove them, remove the bolts that attach the shafts to the lift arms and lift out the assemblies. The maintenance process is the same as for the deck lift jacks. Before reinstalling the assemblies, position the mounting brackets on the jack shafts so there is about 1 inch of thread exposed. Turn the shafts on the jack screws until there is 18 to 19 inches of screw exposed as measured from the top of the transmission assembly to the bottom of the nut assembly. Reconnect the shafts to the lift arms. With the roof locked, check for play in both rear roof power links. If there is no play, remove the clevis pin from the power link turnbuckle to relieve any pressure from the front roof. Then back off the left and right power link bracket fore and aft adjustment screws until some play can be detected in the power links. Now tighten the adjustment screws until all play is taken up. Then tighten the screws an additional 1/2 turn and tighten both lock nuts. There is an up and down adjustment provided on these brackets, but there is no mention of them in the shop manual. Setting both adjustments so the top of the brackets are on equal distance of about 3/4 of an inch above the floor will keep the top from leaning to one side or the other during the erect or retract cycles. Tighten the 4 bracket retaining nuts on both brackets. Now, turn the control link adjusting screws down until they just contact the control link arm. Tighten the screws an additional 2 turns and tighten the lock nut. Replace the power link turnbuckle clevis pins and keepers. Turn the roof lift jack shafts as needed to align the lower mounting bolts with the holes in their mounting brackets. The bolts should slide straight through. The shafts can only be adjusted in increments of 1 complete turn, so it may be necessary to turn the transmission worm gear to obtain proper alignment. Once the bolts are installed, install the lock washers and nuts and tighten them down. Reconnect the flexible drive shafts to the roof motor. Position the washers in the notches in the lift jacks and tighten the lock nuts. The roof lift tie bar keeps the roof lift arms from bending during operation. To adjust, measure the distance between the bottoms of the left and right lift arms. Loosen the lock nuts and adjust the turnbuckles so that the distance between the tops of the left and right lift arms equals the distance measured at the bottom. Partially unlock the roof and tighten the roof lock nut mounting screws. tighten the rear roof lock nut and lock screw assemblies. Raise the roof until you can easily reach the front roof lock screw assemblies. To keep the assembly from moving, put a little tension on the pivot screw, the inboard one, first. Then put a little tension on the movable screw, the outboard one. Now go back and tighten the pivot screw and then the movable one. Use the actuation switch or jump the roof erect relay to bring the roof to a point where the front roof lock screws are about 1 inch above the windshield header. The front roof lock screw should be in line with the front roof lock nuts and be an equal distance above the windshield header. If one or both of these requirements are not met, you will have to refine the adjustments for the roof lift jacks and the control link adjusting screws. According to the shop manual, lengthening or shortening the roof lift jacks moves the front of the roof left or right, and the left and right control link adjustment changes the height of the front of the roof while the rear remains practically constant. What it doesn't tell you is that changing either adjustment affects the other. It also doesn't tell you which side to adjust. If you need to move the roof to the right, do you shorten the right roof jack or lengthen the left one? What works best for me is to first shorten the linkage on the side that you want the front of the roof to move toward. That is, if you need to move the front of the roof to the right, shorten the lift jack on the right side, 1 full turn. If you still need to move the roof to the right, lengthen the left screw jack 1 full turn. Note that turning the jack shaft to the left, as viewed from the rear, shortens the overall length of the screw jack, and turning it to the right lengthens it. This is because turning the shaft also turns the nut on the screw jack. So while you gain 1/16 of an inch at the top, you lose 1/8 of an inch in overall length. If you shorten the lift jack, the roof will raise higher off the header on the same side. So you need to adjust the control links in order to equalize the clearance between the front roof lock screws and the header. Again, should we take up the adjustment on the low side or back up the adjustment on the high side? Since we need the front roof lock screws to enter their locks slightly before the rear screws, let's start by backing off the adjustment screw on the high side. If more than 1 full turn is required, take up the adjustment screw on the opposite side. The shop manual says not to make the control link adjustments with the weight of the roof on the linkage. So while actually making the adjustment, block the roof at the header. You will have to remove the blocks to recheck the adjustment. As you can see, it is necessary to go back and forth between the roof lift jack adjustment and the control link adjustment until the front roof lock screws line up correctly with their lock nuts. When properly aligned, the screws should set right down into the lock nuts as the top sets down on the windshield header. We positioned the rear roof lock assemblies when we adjusted the roof. Now we need to adjust the length of the screws to obtain a proper seal between the roof and the body. To do this, back out the set screws on the rear lock screws and adjust them so that the weather stripping on the bottom of the rear roof is compressed against the plates over the rear roof lock nuts when the top is fully locked. Do not shorten the screws up so much that they do not bottom out in the lock nuts, as then the switches will not operate properly. There should be some gap between the roof side ornament and the lock nut covers. This will likely take a few tries until you get it right. Don't forget to tighten the set screws before attempting to lock the roof. need to make a similar adjustment on the front roof locks. This time, we want the weather stripping between the front roof and the windshield header to be compressed all the way across, and again, we need to be sure that the lock screws bottom out in their nuts. As with the rear lock screws, if the screws don't bottom in their nuts, the switches will not operate properly. Also, there could be so much pressure on the lock screws that the bearings will actually pull through the transmission casing. To make this adjustment, loosen the set screws and adjust the lock nuts. Be sure to tighten the set screws before locking the roof. Since it is difficult to see when you have a good seal between the windshield header and the front roof, try laying a dollar bill on the header before locking the roof. With the roof locked, the bill should be held snugly, but not so tight you can't pull it out. If your weather stripping is old and hard, it is possible you won't be able to get a good seal without over-tightening the locks. If this is true, you probably should consider replacing the weather stripping. With the roof clear of the trunk, loosen the 3 bolts that secure the roof guide to their mounts on both sides. Position the roof to where the control link guide pins are just about to enter the roof guides. Move the rear guides inward as far as they will go, and then move the front of the guides to a position where the guide pins can enter without hitting the sides of the guides. Fully retract the roof. This will force the guides into position. Now erect the roof until it clears the trunk and tighten the roof guide mounting screws. The package tray transmission may be cleaned and repacked like the other transmissions. But in order to do that, the package tray must be removed, and that is beyond the scope of this presentation. Refer to the shop manual for the procedure to remove and replace the package tray. Unlike the other transmissions, there are 2 worm gears and 2 driven gears. At the ends of the worm gears, there are 2 external adjustment screws. These screws should be adjusted so that there is some, but minimal end play in the worm gears. The motor worm gear should be adjusted when the package tray is folded. The other one should be adjusted with the package tray extended. Turn the screws in as far as they will go, then back them out just a touch. When adjusted properly, there should be no binding throughout the extend and fold cycles. It may be necessary to refine these adjustments should any binding be noticed. With the roof fully retracted and the deck lid open, we can adjust the package tray. To adjust the package tray, it must be fully extended. This can be done with the actuating switch or by jumping the retract cycle tray relay. Loosen the adjusting screws on the retract cycle tray switch actuator and on the switch mounting plate. Loosen the mounting screws on the 2 metal bars that project from the package tray. These guys don't seem to have a name or adjustment procedure in the shop manual. Loosen the lock nut and turn the adjustable stop screws in as far as they will go on both hinges. Loosen the screws that attach the package tray to their hinges. Manually operate the package tray extend relay with a jumper until the motor stalls. Adjust the stop screws on both hinges until they contact the deck lid and the tray is parallel with the deck, then tighten the lock nuts. Lower the deck lid until it is a few inches above closing. Leave it open enough to allow access to the package tray hinge screws. Now move the tray fore or aft to slightly compress the weather seal and maintain an equal distance between the tray and the deck lid. Then tighten the hinge screws. Raise the deck lid a bit so you have access to the 2 nameless metal bars. Move the bars toward the deck as far as they will go without forcing them. They should slide over the tabs that are welded to the deck lid. I believe the purpose of these guys is to ensure the middle of the package tray is properly seated against the weather seal. Position the switch mounting plate so that the actuator adjusting screws are approximately in the middle of the adjustment slot when the actuator just touches the switch plunger. Place a 1/10 inch gauge between the switch plunger and the actuator. Push the actuator toward the switch until the plunger is completely depressed. Tighten the adjusting screws and remove the gauge. Loosen the mounting screws on the Erect cycle tray limit switch. Raise the deck lid all the way and operate the tray fold relay until the motor stalls. Place a 1/10 inch gauge between the switch actuator part of the tray support arm and the switch plunger. Push the switch to the end of its travel, tighten the mounting screws, and remove the gauge. Since we are back here, let's adjust the roof retract limit switch. Unless you have long, thin arms, you may want to raise the roof enough to access the roof retract limit switch mounting screws. Loosen the screws and then tighten them to the point of lock washer contact. With the roof fully retracted and setting on the wheel well pads, hold a 1/10 inch gauge between the switch actuator and the roof control link. Move the switch forward to the end of its travel against the gauge and tighten the mounting screws. You may have to raise the roof again in order to tighten the screws. Four rear roof bumpers are provided to take the load off the rear roof locks and reduce lateral movement on the top. With the roof fully erect and locked, turn the four rubber bumpers located on both sides of the rear roof quarters until they touch the body. Raise the roof until you have easy access to the bumpers and turn them an additional half turn. Then tighten the lock nuts. The last adjustment on the top is the roof position A switch. With the roof erected and locked, loosen the mounting screws and place a 10/1000th inch gauge between the switch plunger and the rear roof power link. Firmly hold the switch down on the end of its plunger travel and tighten the mounting screws. If the deck lid was manually unlocked, you will have to repair that little problem now before you can proceed. Now that we have the roof properly positioned, we can adjust the deck lid for proper fit and seal in its opening. If you haven't already done so, loosen the mounting screws on both deck lock screw and nut assemblies. If you removed a deck lock nut to make switch adjustments, you will need to put it back at this time. Install the nut so that its top is flush with the top of its mounting bracket and tighten the clamp screw. Adjust the deck lock nut on the other side the same way. We will correct this adjustment later. It is a good idea to put a light inside the luggage compartment so you can see how the deck locks are lining up when the deck lid is nearly closed. Removing the trunk lining board at the front of the luggage compartment will allow passing a trouble light in from the back seat area. With the roof fully erect and locked and the package tray folded under, lower the deck lid to a point where you have just enough opening to have access to the 3 bolts that retain the hinge mounting bracket to the deck lid. Loosen the 3 bolts on both sides of the deck lid, then tighten them just enough for the lock washers to make contact. Do not loosen the bolts that attach the bracket to the hinge at this time. Lower the deck lid a little at a time until you can clearly see how it is aligned with the trunk opening. Using the remote starter button to jump the deck close relay makes this a lot easier. If the weather stripping contacts the lip around the opening, it is very difficult to move the deck lid around. So it takes a few times of slightly raising the deck lid, moving it fore or aft, left or right, then slightly closing the deck lid and checking its position. Pay particular attention to the area where the front of the deck lid meets the rear of the roof at the rear window. There should be equal clearance across the length of the rear window, and the weather seal must be tight. Once you have the deck positioned so it looks like it is centered in the opening, check for alignment of the deck lock screws and nut assemblies. It may be necessary to shift the lock screw and/or lock nut assemblies to get them to line up enough to lock the deck lid. Once the deck lid is properly positioned, raise it just enough to gain access to the hinge bracket bolts. Raising the deck too high will allow the weight of the deck lid to cause it to shift and mess up your adjustments. Tighten all 6 hinge bolts. Raise the deck lid and tighten the screws and nuts that hold the lock screw and lock nut assemblies. Loosen the set screw that retains the lock nut in the housing and adjust the nut up or down to a position where the lock screws bottom out in the lock nut, and the deck lid is flush with the body surface when the deck lid is closed and locked. Be sure to tighten the set screw before attempting any trial locking. The up or down adjustment of the deck lid basically only affects the clearance and seal of the rear of the deck lid with the lower back panel. This is probably the most difficult adjustment to make. Unless you can find a volunteer to lie down in the trunk while you close and lock it, it's pretty hard to tell when you have a good seal at the back panel, and nearly impossible to keep the deck lid from moving when the mounting screws are loose enough to change the position of the deck. I have had reasonable success with the following procedure. With the deck lid closed and locked, check the clearance between the back panel and the deck lid. It should be between 1/8 and 1/4 of an inch depending on the condition of your weather stripping, and equal all the way across. When making this adjustment, remember, a little movement at the mounting screws is going to change the gap at the back panel quite a bit, so go slowly. If the gap is too wide, raise the deck lid and prop it open. Loosen the middle and rear screws that attach the mounting bracket to the hinges and tighten them until the lock washers just make contact. Push down on the lower part of the deck and tighten the rearmost screw. You may need some help with this maneuver. Repeat the process on the other hinge. If the gap is too small, raise the deck lid and loosen the middle screw that attaches the mounting bracket to the hinge. While holding up on the deck lid near the top, loosen the rear screw. Relax the upward pressure on the deck lid slightly and allow the weight of the deck to move itself. The hinge bracket should pivot on the front screw and raise up at the rear screw. Tighten the rear screw. After adjusting the gap, check the position of the hinge in relation to the deck lid. They should be parallel. That is, the distance between the hinge and the deck should be equal at both ends of the hinge. Also, the distance should be equal on both hinges. If not, loosen the top screw and position the deck as necessary. Tighten the screw and repeat the process on the other hinge. The shop manual says a special tool, T57P-15780-A, is required to adjust the deck position V-switch and actuator. While it may be somewhat easier with the tool, it certainly is not required. There is plenty of adjustment on the deck position V-switch mounting plate to allow the actuator to be just about anywhere as long as it exists and contacts the plunger. If you don't have the special tool, measure the distance from the bottom of the deck lid to the shoulder of the deck lock screw. Then measure from the bottom of the deck lid to the bottom of the switch actuator. This distance should be 1/4 inch less than the distance measured to the shoulder of the screw. Bend the actuator to meet the requirement. The deck position V-switch adjustment can be made several ways. You can use the special tool and the shop manual. You can set the switch in the middle of its adjustment Fully lock the deck and see if the cycle indicator light goes out. If the light stays on, open the deck, move the switch up a little, and try again. Once you get the light to go out, see if the deck lid pops up when it starts to open. If it does, bend the switch actuator down slightly. Or, you can remove the deck lock screw assembly, replace the nut and bolt that attaches the switch actuator, and turn the screw into the lock until it ratchets. Then follow the same procedure as outlined in the shop manual, as if you had used a special tool. Now that the roof and deck lid are properly adjusted and functioning smoothly, you may have to readjust the vent, door, and quarter windows for correct alignment and seal with the roof. The procedure for making these adjustments is beyond the scope of this presentation, but can be found in your shop manual. Replace the cover on the relay control box, replace the back seat, and reinstall the moldings, trim, access cover, sun visors, and mirror. And now you are done. Phew. About once a year, lubricate all hinges and pivot points with a light machine oil or 10-weight motor oil. Slide the covers up on the deck and roof lift jacks. Wipe off old lubricant and apply a light coat of lubriplate or similar light grease on all lock and lift jack screws. Some folks prefer to lubricate the lock and lift jack screws by brushing on SDP oil treatment. Either method is okay.
Don't stop the tape yet. There are some folks who can provide you with whatever you need for your retract.